Hey there guys, it's Mr. Herbst here, and I'm going to go ahead and do a little walkthrough of our Ecology Unit Study Guide. I'm going to switch things up a little bit in the sense that I am going to read off of the study guide itself and help you guys sort of figure out these answers more or less on your own. I'm going to try to pop up as many pictures as I can on the screen here that I will use as an aid for describing the certain things that are on the study guide. But I'm going to go ahead and start with question 1. What is ecology? Well, ecology is simply the study of the interactions of life that has with other life, but also the study of life and its non-living environment. So it's basically the study of relationships that go on in biology. So predator-prey, wolf to rabbit, but also the wolf has to combat all of the non-living things such as the cold temperatures and the rainfall and the snowfall and all these things. Ecology studies all that stuff. Question number 2. In the following table, list the levels of organization and give an example of that level. Well, the first level, the first box there is the single organism level or the individual level. This right here is a picture of a grasshopper. This is the single organism, the first level of organization. This is an organism or the individual level. Now this right here is a bunch of grasshoppers. This is a population of grasshoppers of the same species. That's what a population is. All of the grasshoppers, from the same species combined. And then a community is a bunch of different species, different populations of species that live in a single area. And an ecosystem is all of those communities and all those populations of organisms living together, but also combined with their non-living environment. So now we're talking about things like the soil and the rainfall and all those things that contribute and that allow organisms to live there. That's an ecosystem. A biome is an area on Earth that shares very similar climates, and you'd find very similar organisms. So if we look at all of the Midwest, you know, from Wisconsin to Illinois, Iowa, and parts of Minnesota, all of those areas share very similar ways that they look. You know, they all kind of have the same type of trees. In the summertime, they have the same type of flowers. Even though the ecosystems might not be exactly the same in each one of those areas, the climate is generally the same. And so that's what we call a biome. And finally, the sixth and the highest level of organization is the biosphere. That's the whole Earth. All of the places that life can live on Earth is called the biosphere. So number 3, which level is the smallest? That is the organism, the individual organism level. Which level is the largest? That is the biosphere. Moving on. Number 5 is comparing abiotic and biotic factors. Remember here, guys, you really want to use your root words. The word bio means life, and the word a means like not or without. And so biotic would mean like life factors, and abiotic would mean non-life factors. So to start with abiotic factors, those are all of the non-living things that shape what ecosystems look like. For example, it could be like things like rain or air or temperature. If an area has a lot of rainfall, then typically would find a lot of plants there, a lot of green plants, like hence the rainforest. Biotic factors are all of the living things that sort of interact that shape what ecosystems look like. Predators, you know, one organism has to eat another one. Symbiosis, competition, when organisms compete for resources, all of those things shape what ecosystems look like, and all of those things that shape what ecosystems look like are caused by life itself. Number 6, what is the main source of energy of all of life on Earth? That is the sun. Without the sun, guys, we would not be here. The sun gives rise to the plants, and then organisms eat the plants, and then organisms eat those organisms, and then organisms eat those organisms. Eventually, we are the top dogs, and we eat the things that ate the other things that ate the plants, and the plants use their energy from the sun. So, number 7, how are the following words related or unrelated? What I want you guys to do is come up with 4 sentences of how the words autotroph, producer, heterotroph, and consumer are either related or unrelated. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of what I mean. Now, so for one of those examples, you could say something like autotrophs produce food. Heterotrophs consume autotrophs. Or you could say that autotrophs produce their own food from the sun, and heterotrophs have to eat their own food. You could also say that consumers feed on producers. So I'm going to go ahead and let you guys come up with the other two on your own. All right, you guys. Number 8, name the 5 different types of heterotrophs. Remember, heterotrophs are things that have to eat their own food. So list 2 examples of each organism and then draw a picture of what that type of organism eats. So the first type of heterotroph is our herbivores. Herbivores, remember, use your root words there, herb, relate that to what a plant is. So an herbivore is a plant eater. So I'm sure you can think of a lot of different plant eaters. Think things that eat plants. The carnivores, use your root words. Carne is a Spanish word for meat. Carnivores are the meat eaters. So we're talking here about like sharks and tigers, things like that. Omnivores are the things that can eat both plants and animals. Now we're talking about human beings, for example, can eat both plants and animals. And also, not a lot of people know this, but bears spend a lot of their time eating things like berries and getting honey. They can hunt down meat and use that for food, but they do eat an omnivorous diet. They eat both plants and animals. Another type of heterotroph is detritivores. Detritivores are things like worms and snails. They live on dead stuff. They basically eat soil. They eat dead remains of plants and animals. And then our decomposers here are things that can basically eat any organic matter, and that is or anything that had that was once living at one time. They tend to break down organic matter into smaller bits. The things like decomposers, a good example of decomposers are fungi and bacteria. All right, guys, keeping up. Remember, at any time that you need to pause this video, make sure that you do and write down the study guide. Remember, I will be collecting the study guide 4 points. But anyway, on to question 9 here, guys. Describe what direction energy flows in an ecosystem. Well, remember, it all starts with the sun. Here's a picture on my left here. I'm sorry, that would be on my right. It all starts here with the sun. The sun gives off energy that plants can use to make food, and then there are organisms that eat those plants, and then there are organisms that eat those things that ate the plants. So the energy flows from the sun to the autotrophs, aka the producers, over to the consumers, aka the heterotrophs. And then what is the difference between a food chain and a food web? Well, here is a picture of a food chain. It's basically a simple steps of organisms eating and being eaten. For example, we could start here with something like algae. Plankton eats the algae. Small fish eat the plankton. Larger fish will eat those smaller fish. Squid might eat those larger fish. And then finally, things like sharks or whales might eat those things that ate all of those other things. And then finally, even if you wanted to include one level after that, humans are capable of eating way up here on the food chain. We can eat anything on the food chain, so we are capable of even eating the shark. A food web, though, is basically, think about it like all of the food chains in an ecosystem combined. It gets to be really complicated. So here's a picture of a food web. It's not a very simple, here's one step, here's one step, here's one step. It's a whole mess of all of the organisms eating and being eaten. So it's a complex chain of all of the food chains in an ecosystem. And then also question 11 here is asking, what does the arrow in the food chain represent? Well, that arrow represents the transfer of energy, where the energy is going. So it starts with the producers. They use their energy from the sun, and they are going to give some of their energy to their first level consumers, then to the second level consumers, the third level consumers, and so on and so forth. I am going to use a diagram here. This is called an ecological pyramid. You can see here that each of those things, each of those levels on the ecological pyramid, that is what we call a trophic level. And so it's sort of a feeding step. The baseline right there is the where we start with the producers, then we go to the first level consumers, then the second level consumers, third level consumers, fourth level consumers, and so on and so forth. So each one of those levels is called a trophic level. And one really important thing to understand here, guys, is that if, say, we have some energy in the first trophic level, and let's say that we have 10 units of energy, only 10% of that energy gets passed to the next level. And so 90% of the energy lost in each trophic level gets lost in the form of heat. So that takes us up to question 13 and 14 here, guys. Number 15, I'm going to go ahead and let you guys do that on your own. Remember, step one is the bottom level. We're starting with the producers. Let's say the producers have 100% of the energy. Well, what will be the next level look like? And how much percent of the energy would be transferred to the next level? So I will look at this and make sure that your math is correct. Let's go ahead and go on to question number 16 here. The difference between a habitat and a niche. Well, a habitat is sort of like where an organism lives. So I have a picture here of a coral reef. This is where organisms live. However, something like a clownfish here, or Nemo, its little niche is sort of its little job or little role that it plays in that ecosystem or that habitat. And so ultimately, the coral reef is the habitat, but the niche is actually the little job that the clownfish does. And its job is to get cleaned off by the sea anemone, and the sea anemone gets a little bit of a meal. You can sort of think of it like this. You know, your house is your habitat. You live in your house. It's where you live. However, your job in your habitat is to keep your room. Your room is your niche, to keep your room clean and tidy so your parents are happy, right? Number 17, define symbiosis in your own words. I'll tell you what, I'm not going to give you the answer to this one, but I will describe to you how to break down that word symbiosis. One of the best ways to learn science here, guys, is to learn Latin. Sym means together, bio, once again, means life, and sys is a process. So put those root words together and come up with the definition for symbiosis on your own. Number 18, I'm also going to let you guys go ahead and do on your own. Explain how the competition affects an ecosystem. I briefly touched on that earlier. I'll let you handle that one on your own. 19, explain how predation can affect an ecosystem. Well, if you think about it, when organisms eat one another, they're basically saying organisms can only get to a certain level of how many individuals exist in that environment. And so predation sort of limits population size. If you think about it, there's not an unlimited amount of rabbits out there for wolves to eat. The wolves eat a certain number of rabbits, so it basically limits how many rabbits can live there, because if there was a lot of rabbits, then there would be a lot more wolves around. Number 20, give an example of each of the following types of symbiosis. Remember, mutualism, once again, guys, use your root words. Mutual means benefit on both parts. So it's two pluses. Both parties benefit from that relationship. And if you recall, I like to use some really cool examples from our own human body. An example of mutualism going on in you and me right now is the bacteria that lives in your gut. You give it a nice humid place to live, and you get vitamin K out of it. Commensalism. This, remember, is where one organism benefits, and then the other organism is neither harmed nor helped. It has zero effect. And a good example of that going on in your body right now, remember, is those little eye mites that are on your, that live on your eyelashes. You give them your dead skin, and they get a meal. However, you don't even notice that they're there. So it doesn't affect you. You have no effect. And then parasitism, this is where one organism is clearly benefited, so they get a plus, and then the other organism is harmed. It's a minus. Good example of that is if somebody had a parasitic worm, such as a tapeworm, living in their body. The tapeworms eat the food that they are eating, and it causes the person to lose weight. And ultimately, sometimes tapeworms can cause people to die. It's very rare, but it can occur. So the the host or the host of the parasite is harmed. However, the parasite is happy and gets fed. So moving on here, guys, 21, define ecological succession in your own words. Well, I'll tell you what, ecological succession, think of the word success. It is the success of an ecosystem. It's a series of different changes that allow for, that eventually lead to a climax community. What a climax community is something like a forest. Forests don't just spring up all over the place. If you think how many different things forests actually need to live there, it takes a long time for forests to show up, which is why we should preserve as many forests as possible. Forests are what we call a climax community. Lots of soil there. So ecological succession is all of the changes that eventually lead up to forests. So when new land is formed, that new land is bare rock. So here's a picture of bare rock. Now, there are not very many organisms that can live on bare rock. Trees certainly cannot live on bare rock. So the organisms that can live on bare rock are what we call pioneer species, things like moss and lichens. Here's a picture of some moss and lichens living on bare rock. Those organisms have the capability of living on the rock, and they help to kind of break down the rock. And you know what's even more important is they begin to form a small layer of soil. And over time, that small layer of soil will eventually allow larger organisms to, larger plants and larger organisms to live in that area. And then once we get larger organisms, now we have more dead stuff, which is going to form more soil. Soil is ultimately dead stuff. And so the more soil we have, the bigger organisms can grow in that environment. So it all starts out with bare rock. Remember, not much stuff can live on bare rock. Only basically mosses and lichens, and those things are going to break down the rock into soil and decompose and form soil and eventually lead to climax communities. So what I just described to you here, guys, was, well, we first did number 23, what is a pioneer species, but also I described to you primary succession. Primary succession is where we start with bare rock, and organisms begin to die, form some soil, and eventually it might lead to a whole forest community. Here's a picture of primary succession. Now, secondary succession is very similar to primary succession, only it's where the soil is already there. So imagine we had a forest and the forest burns down. It's going to kill all the trees. Everything is going to die. However, the soil is still there. So the soil is going to allow some saplings and some smaller trees to start to pop up, and eventually it'll form that big forest once again. So secondary succession is once the soil is already there. All right, guys, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. If that primary and secondary succession is kind of confusing to you, check out in the description of this video below. There's a 2.5 minute animation on primary and secondary succession that might be able to help you out. Number 24, list the 3 limiting factors that would decrease a population size. So think about what happens when populations get very dense. When people, for example, live in cities, think of all the issues that happen when people live in cities. Well, now there's a need for more food. We need more food because so many people are living in those small areas. We also, it's also much easier for disease to spread from person to person. So all those things decrease population size. As populations go up, things like disease, starvation, and competition begin to take over and limit that population size. What 3 factors do not depend on population size? What I'm asking you here is to describe some things that don't really, it doesn't matter how big the population is or how dense the population is. They're going to limit populations regardless of how many individuals are there. That's things like floods, droughts, and storms. You know, those things are just going to wail on different organisms and ecosystems and destroy things regardless of whether or not populations exploded. So 24 is asking us density dependent factors. Okay, that was a word that we learned in our population ecology PowerPoint. 24 once again is asking about population density dependent factors. And then 25 was asking about population independent density factors. 26, what is carrying capacity? Well, I demonstrated that as basically the amount of organisms that an ecosystem can support. So there is not an unlimited amount of resources in any ecosystem. Eventually they'll reach the point where there is the maximum amount of resources that these organisms are drawing from and living from, and eventually will not will max on how many of those organisms can live there. Number 27, draw a dashed line here to indicate where the carrying capacity line is. Here is a picture of carrying capacity. Do you see that little dotted line right there? That dotted line is the carrying capacity. Now, if you take a look at the other line, how it kind of goes up and it can kind of wiggle up and down, well, once again, it's not like organisms are bam, this is how high they're going to get. Well, the amount of the organisms might fluctuate up and down, but it's on an average going to only be able to reach that carrying capacity, which we also labeled K. And now one thing I want to, which is not in your study guide, that I want to go ahead and make sure that we understand is the difference between logistic and exponential growth. Take a look over here. This is a picture of exponential growth. Exponential growth is where populations sort of start out real slow, their growth rates start out real slow, but then as more and more organisms are added to the population, more and more organisms are able to reproduce, and then bam, the population sort of shoots off and explodes, and eventually we have this sort of massive increase in the amount of individuals in that population. This is what happens. This is what has been happening with human beings, and this is what happens also with bacteria, where the populations sort of explode, and we get a lot of organisms at once. It's not very realistic. Generally, a logistic growth is more realistic for ecosystems. This right here is a picture of logistic growth, where the growth rates sort of go up, but they sort of level off. Once again, this is more realistic because, once again, they're going to hit that carrying capacity, and eventually there won't be able to, the ecosystem won't be able to support any more organisms. 28 here, guys. Describe the predator-prey relationship in controlling population densities. Well, if we take a look at that graph right there of logistic growth, well, you got to kind of think about it with a little logic. If there's a lot of rabbits out there, then there's a lot of food for wolves, right? So the wolves are going to have a field day eating those rabbits. And then since the wolves are well fed, they're going to be more likely to reproduce, making more and more wolves. So then guess what's going to happen to the population of rabbits? It's going to go down. So now the population of rabbits will decline a little bit. When the population of rabbits declines a little bit, now the wolves are starving. And so the wolves are sort of going to die off somewhat. They're not going to completely go extinct, but the wolf population will go down. And then what happens when the wolf population goes down? Well, then the rabbits have less of a predator problem, and they're not going to get eaten as much. So their population is going to go on the rise. And so there's sort of this fluctuating going on. So once again, if we have a bunch of prey, then there's a lot of prey for those predators to feed on. And then if there's a lot of prey for those predators to feed on, then the prey population will go down, and then the predator population will go up, and then eventually the prey population will go down, and then also the predator population will go down, and then the prey population will go back up. It's a whole big cycle that goes on in ecosystems. What is diversity? Biodiversity here, guys. Use those root words once again. Bio means life, and diversity means variations or things that different types. So biodiversity is very different life types. And why is it so important for ecosystems and for us? Well, I mean, it ultimately leads to populations being stable. All the different forms of life allow for all these different kinds of niches, allow for all these different food sources of different things, and basically allows organisms to form very complex ecosystems. If suddenly we eliminate a whole ton of life, for example, if we just start chopping down trees all willy-nilly, that throws off all these cycles. So we need all those different kinds of life living in ecosystems for them to be stable. We as humans also benefit from biodiversity in the sense that a lot of different kinds of medicines once were discovered in plants first. And so if we're chopping down the rainforest, we might be destroying plants that could potentially even cure cancer. We don't know. They haven't been found yet. But if we keep chopping them down, we'll never find them. And then why is an invasive species a threat to biodiversity? Well, once again, we got to remember what an invasive species is here, guys. Here's a picture of the Asian carp. I talked about this in class. That is an invasive species. The problem with an invasive species here is that they don't have any natural predators. These Asian carp here, nothing feeds on them. So their population explodes. They go through, once again, that exponential growth. And the problem is that when their populations explode in size, they are eating the food that the natural or the organisms that were there first had. So it's going to make it much harder for the organisms that were there first. For example, if something like a little river minnow or a small fish eats small sources of food, well, if those Asian carp are eating that natural or that organism that was there first, if it was eating their food, now it's very tough for that little organism to survive. And then finally, 32 here, guys, make sure you're comfortable with all of those terms. We learned about those terms on the Freya card quiz, so make sure that you are comfortable with them. Anyway here, guys, make sure that you go ahead and rewind, pause, do whatever you got to do. I want you guys to do real well. This test here will be larger than a previous test. This test will be worth 50 points, so make sure that you guys do real well. Anyway, if you stuck it out and watched the whole thing, congratulations. You made it all the way through. I'm signing off, though, folks. You all have a nice day.